It started on a rainy Friday evening, the kind where the clouds hung low and heavy, pressing against the house like they wanted to be let in. I remember the sound of the rain on the roof, steady but not loud, almost like it was whispering secrets. My daughter had told me earlier in the week that her best friend, Emily, would be spending the weekend with us. I had met Emily before, in passing, just another polite teenage girl with an easy smile, the kind that made you think she had nothing to hide. But when the doorbell rang that night and I opened the door, something about her caught me off guard. She stood there in the dim porch light, her hair damp from the drizzle, eyes bright but hesitant, like she was holding back a whole story she wasn't ready to tell. I told myself it was just the weather making me feel strange, but as she stepped inside and slipped off her shoes, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek, I felt an odd awareness settle over me. It wasn't that I was attracted to her in that moment, at least, not in any way I was ready to admit, but there was something about the way she looked at me, quick glances she tried to disguise as casual, that made the air feel thicker. The weekend was meant to be simple, movies, snacks, maybe some laughter from the living room while I did my own thing. But the first time her fingers brushed mine when I handed her a mug of hot chocolate, something shifted. It was small, barely a moment, but it stayed with me. Later that night, as I passed the hallway on my way to bed, I caught her sitting alone on the couch, the glow of her phone lighting her face. She looked up at me and smiled, soft and almost secretive, and I felt something stir in me that I wasn't prepared for. I went to bed telling myself I was overthinking it, that she was just being friendly. But deep down, somewhere I didn't want to acknowledge, I knew this weekend was going to change something. I didn't know what. Not yet. But the rain kept falling, and the house felt smaller than usual, like it was holding us together in a way we couldn't escape. The next morning the rain had stopped, but the air still carried that damp chill that makes you want to wrap yourself in something warm. I woke earlier than usual, maybe because my mind hadn't stopped working through the night, replaying every look, every pause, every accidental touch from the evening before. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination filling in spaces where there was nothing to fill, but as I walked into the kitchen and saw Emily standing there in one of my daughter's oversized hoodies, her hair a little messy from sleep, barefoot on the cold tile, the thought slipped back in. She was making tea, her movements slow and unhurried, and when she noticed me in the doorway she gave me that same small smile, like we shared some quiet understanding neither of us wanted to put into words. I asked if she had slept well, and she said yes, her voice low, almost shy, and then she offered me tea without waiting for an answer, moving around the kitchen like she'd always belonged there. My daughter wandered in a few minutes later, yawning and cheerful, and for a moment the spell broke. We were just three people having breakfast, talking about nothing important. But every now and then I caught Emily glancing at me over her mug, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough that I noticed. Later in the day they decided to watch a movie in the living room, and I sat at the table with my laptop, pretending to work but really just listening. Their laughter would come in bursts, easy and unguarded, and each time I heard Emily's laugh it did something to me, tugged at a place inside I hadn't paid attention to in years. At one point my daughter went upstairs to get something, leaving Emily alone on the couch. I looked up, and she was already looking at me. It wasn't a bold look, it was quieter than that, almost curious, but it made my heart stumble in my chest. She said, softly, that I seemed different than most mothers she knew. I asked what she meant, and she hesitated, her eyes flicking to the stairs before she said I just had this way of seeing people, like I was really paying attention. The room felt warmer, or maybe it was just me, but before I could respond my daughter came back and the moment folded in on itself like it had never happened. That evening, while the two of them cooked pasta together, I stood in the doorway watching them, but my eyes kept drifting to Emily. The way she moved, the little way she leaned in when she listened, the way her fingers lingered when she handed me a plate, it was all so small, yet impossible to ignore. I told myself again to stop, to let it go, but the truth was I didn't want to. Something was shifting between us, something neither of us had named yet, and I could feel it pulling us closer, even when we tried to keep our distance. That night, after the dishes were washed and my daughter had gone to her room, I found myself restless, wandering the quiet house with the lights dimmed. I could hear faint music coming from upstairs, the kind of soft, dreamy songs that make you feel like you're walking through someone else's memory. I stopped outside the guest room where Emily was staying and noticed her door was slightly ajar, a warm glow spilling out into the hallway. I told myself I was just checking if she needed anything, but the truth was I didn't want to go to bed yet, not when the thought of her being just a few steps away felt so charged. I knocked lightly, and she looked up from where she was sitting cross-legged on the bed, flipping through a worn paperback. She smiled in that same quiet way and told me to come in. I hesitated at the threshold for a moment, then stepped inside, the faint scent of her shampoo lingering in the air. We talked about nothing at first, books, the rain, how cold the nights had been lately, but there was an undercurrent, a hum in the space between us that made every word feel heavier than it should. She shifted slightly, tucking her hair behind her ear, and I caught myself watching her hands, the way her fingers moved with such unconscious grace. She asked about my life, about things my daughter had never told her, and I found myself answering in ways I usually didn't with strangers. Maybe it was the intimacy of the dim room, or the way her eyes held mine without looking away, but I spoke more honestly than I had in a long time. She listened like each sentence mattered, like there was something in my voice she was searching for. At one point, there was a pause, long enough for me to feel the weight of it settle over us, and she said softly that she'd always felt different, like she never quite fit in where she was supposed to. There was a vulnerability in her voice that pulled at me, and I told her I understood more than she might think. Her eyes searched mine, and for a moment neither of us moved. The silence wasn't awkward, it was thick, electric, almost fragile, like the wrong word might shatter it. Then my daughter's laughter rang out from the other end of the hall, breaking the moment and pulling us back into the safe space of small talk. I stood to leave, telling her to get some rest, and she nodded, but as I reached the door she said my name in a voice so soft it made me turn back. She didn't say anything else, just gave me a look I couldn't quite read, a look that stayed with me long after I closed my bedroom door. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every second of that conversation, every glance, every pause, and I knew with a certainty that something between us had shifted again. The line between who we were supposed to be and whatever this was becoming had blurred just a little more, and I couldn't decide if I wanted to step back, or take another step forward. The next day carried a strange kind of quiet, the kind that makes you feel like the air itself is holding its breath. My daughter had plans to meet another friend in the afternoon, leaving Emily and me alone in the house. I told myself it was no big deal, that it would just be a few hours, but as soon as the front door closed behind my daughter, I felt a shift, like the balance in the room had tilted. Emily was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water, and she asked if I wanted to watch something or maybe just sit and talk. I agreed to the latter, though I didn't fully understand why, maybe because talking to her had started to feel too easy, too tempting. We settled on the couch, not too close but close enough that I could feel the warmth from her body. At first, our conversation stayed light, movies, books, random stories, but every now and then it dipped into something deeper, the kind of topics you don't usually share with someone you haven't known for years. She told me about growing up in a house where no one really listened, where silence was more common than laughter, and how she had always envied families that felt close. I listened, watching the way her expression shifted between sadness and something almost hopeful, and I found myself telling her about moments from my own past, things I rarely spoke of, even to people I trusted. Somewhere in the middle of all this, I noticed her knees had angled toward me, her posture open, her gaze steady in a way that felt deliberate. There were pauses in our conversation, those lingering, unspoken pauses where you both know there's more you could say, more you could admit, but you hold it back because speaking it out loud might change everything. At one point, she laughed at something I said, leaning forward so that her hand briefly touched my arm. It was casual, maybe even accidental, but it sent a current through me that I tried to mask by looking away. She noticed, though. I could see it in the way her smile softened, almost like she understood. After a while, we moved to the kitchen to make lunch, and the small space made it impossible not to brush past each other. I became hyper-aware of every movement, every time her hand reached for something near me, every moment her shoulder nearly grazed mine. At one point, I turned to hand her a knife, and our fingers touched for just a second longer than necessary. Neither of us said anything, but our eyes met in that instant, and it felt like a conversation without words. We ate at the table, the sound of rain starting again outside, and there was this quiet intimacy in the moment, two people sharing food, sharing space, and yet holding on to something unspoken that hung between us like a fragile thread. By the time my daughter came back, the energy had shifted again, returning to something lighter, safer, as though whatever had been building all afternoon had been carefully folded away for another time. But I knew it was still there, waiting, and I could feel in my chest that this wasn't the kind of thing that simply disappeared. That night felt heavier somehow, as if the quiet in the house had settled deeper into the walls. My daughter had gone to bed early after spending the afternoon out, and I found myself alone in the living room, the soft glow of a lamp pooling light across the coffee table. I told myself I'd just read for a while, maybe let the day unwind from my mind, but then I heard soft footsteps on the stairs. Emily appeared, wearing loose pajama pants and a t-shirt, her hair down and slightly tangled, as if she'd just run her fingers through it. She asked if I was still awake, her voice gentle, almost uncertain, and when I nodded, she came to sit at the far end of the couch. We talked in low voices, almost as though we were afraid to disturb the silence around us. The conversation began with safe topics, school, her plans for the future, but there was an undercurrent beneath her words, a weight that made me feel like she was circling something unspoken. At one point she shifted, tucking her legs beneath her and leaning slightly closer, her eyes catching the lamplight in a way that made them seem impossibly open. She asked if I'd ever felt like I was living a life that wasn't entirely mine, like I'd been following rules that someone else had written for me. The question landed heavier than I expected, and I felt my throat tighten before I could answer. I told her, quietly, that I had, more times than I could count. She held my gaze for a long moment, and it was in that space between us that something subtle, dangerous, and undeniable moved closer. She told me she often felt drawn to people she wasn't supposed to be drawn to, and though her words were vague, the way she said them made it feel like they were meant for me. My pulse quickened, my mind scrambling for something to say that wouldn't break the moment but wouldn't cross the line we both knew was there. Instead, I just nodded, and the air between us seemed to hum with something alive. A clap of thunder rolled in the distance, and she shivered, pulling the blanket from the back of the couch over her lap. Without thinking, I reached to adjust it for her, and my fingers brushed the bare skin of her wrist. It was such a small thing, but it felt like the whole room shifted in that instant, like the night itself leaned in to watch. She didn't pull away. In fact, she let her hand linger there for just a second longer, her eyes never leaving mine. The sound of the rain outside grew louder, filling the silence between us, and I realized my breathing had gone shallow. I told myself to move, to get up, to end this before it turned into something neither of us could take back, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed there, feeling the weight of her closeness, the quiet pull that had been growing for days now pressing against the edges of what was safe. Eventually, she leaned back, breaking the spell with a small smile, and said she should probably get some sleep. I watched her walk toward the stairs, the faint scent of her shampoo lingering in the air long after she was gone, and I knew with absolute certainty that this was no longer something I could ignore. Whatever it was between us, it had taken root, and there was no going back to pretending it wasn't there. The next day the air in the house felt different, as if the walls themselves were aware of what was happening and had decided to hold their breath. Morning light filtered weakly through the curtains, casting pale shadows across the kitchen where I stood making coffee. I heard soft footsteps behind me and turned to see Emily, her hair still messy from sleep, wearing one of my daughter's oversized sweaters that hung loosely from her shoulders. She greeted me with that quiet, almost knowing smile, and without asking she reached for a mug and poured herself some coffee, moving around the space with a kind of ease that made it feel like she belonged there. My daughter was still asleep upstairs, and the realization that we were alone again made my heart beat faster. We sat at the table, the steam rising from our cups, the conversation starting off with little things, how she'd slept, the sound of the rain through the night, but beneath every word was something unspoken, a low hum that had been growing between us. At one point she asked me about my marriage, about whether I had ever been truly happy, and the question caught me off guard. I hesitated before answering, my fingers tracing the rim of my mug, and I told her that happiness was complicated, that sometimes it came in pieces and sometimes it faded without you even realizing it. She didn't look away, and in that steady gaze I felt as if she could see more than I wanted her to. She said she understood, that she had watched her own parents drift apart in silence, and there was something in her voice that made me ache, a sadness that felt too old for her years. The kitchen felt smaller then, the air thicker, and I was suddenly aware of how close we were sitting. Her knee brushed mine under the table, not enough to be deliberate but not entirely accidental either, and neither of us moved to change it. The sound of the clock ticking seemed louder, marking the seconds as if time itself had slowed down to trap us in this moment. She leaned forward slightly, resting her chin on her hand, and asked if I'd ever felt something I couldn't explain, something that didn't make sense but wouldn't leave me alone. I wanted to answer honestly, to tell her that I felt it now, sitting here with her, but the words lodged in my throat. Instead, I just held her gaze, and I knew she understood even without me saying it. My daughter's footsteps coming down the stairs broke the moment like a sudden gust of wind, and we both shifted back in our seats, the connection folding itself away like it had so many times before. The rest of the morning passed in polite conversation, the three of us together, but every time our eyes met across the room, I felt that same quiet pull, that same dangerous thread binding us a little tighter. By the time evening came, I knew that the line between us had blurred beyond repair, and the question was no longer if something would happen, it was when. That evening my daughter decided to go out for a few hours with friends, leaving Emily and me alone again, and this time the silence between us felt heavier, more deliberate, like we were both aware of what was about to happen even if neither of us had said it out loud. She was curled up on the couch with a blanket, scrolling absent-mindedly through her phone when I walked into the room, but she looked up immediately, her eyes finding mine and holding them for a second longer than necessary. I sat down on the opposite end of the couch, the space between us feeling like it was alive, and for a while we just talked quietly, our voices low as though we were afraid to disturb something fragile. She told me more about her life, how she'd always felt like she was searching for a place where she belonged, how even in her closest friendships she often felt like an outsider, and I found myself telling her things I hadn't planned to share. I spoke about the parts of my life that felt empty, the ways I'd learned to hide my own loneliness behind routines and responsibilities. She listened with that same intense focus that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years, her expression soft but unreadable, her gaze never breaking. At one point she shifted closer, her leg brushing against mine under the blanket, and neither of us moved away. The warmth of that small contact was enough to make my pulse quicken, and I could feel the energy in the room change, tightening like a string pulled taut. The rain had started again outside, the sound steady and rhythmic, filling the spaces between our words. She asked me what I was thinking, and for a moment I considered lying, saying something safe, but instead I told her the truth, that I wasn't sure if I was imagining what was happening between us or if she felt it too. Her lips curved into the smallest smile, and she said she felt it. She didn't elaborate, didn't rush to explain, and in that moment the silence spoke louder than anything else. She leaned slightly closer, and I could smell the faint sweetness of her shampoo, see the way her hair fell across her cheek. My chest felt tight, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of wanting something I knew I shouldn't. Before either of us could close the distance, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke whatever had been about to happen, and we both straightened instantly, the moment tucking itself away like a secret that only we knew existed. My daughter came inside minutes later, chatting happily about her night, and Emily slipped easily back into her friendly, harmless role. But later, when I was cleaning up in the kitchen, she passed by me and let her fingers graze the back of my hand, the touch so quick it could have been an accident, yet when I looked up, she was already looking at me with that same quiet, knowing expression, and I understood that nothing about it had been accidental. The morning she was leaving, the house felt strangely hollow, as if it already knew she wouldn't be in it by nightfall. I woke early, not because I had to, but because I couldn't sleep knowing it was our last few hours together. The light coming through the kitchen window was soft and pale, the kind of light that makes everything feel like a memory before it's even over. I made coffee, listening to the faint creak of the stairs, and when she appeared, wearing jeans and a loose sweater, her hair still damp from a shower, I felt that now familiar rush of warmth and something sharper underneath it. She smiled at me, but it wasn't the casual smile she'd worn the first night, it was slower, softer, as though she knew this moment mattered. My daughter joined us soon after, chattering about their plans for the morning before Emily's ride would arrive, and I tried to join in, though every word I spoke felt like it was balancing on something I didn't dare name. We spent the next hour in a haze of casual conversation, the three of us together, but every time her eyes found mine across the table, it was like the rest of the room faded. Eventually, my daughter went upstairs to grab the last of Emily's things, leaving us alone. The silence settled immediately, heavy but not uncomfortable, and she stood there by the counter, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug as though she needed it for balance. She said she didn't know how to thank me for the weekend, that she'd felt more at home here than she had in a long time, and I told her she didn't have to thank me at all. Her eyes lingered on me for a moment, searching, and then she set the mug down slowly, almost like she was buying herself time. She stepped closer, close enough that I could see the faint line of her collarbone where her sweater slipped slightly off her shoulder, close enough that I could smell the clean warmth of her skin. My heart was beating so hard I was sure she could hear it, but neither of us moved away. She reached out then, her fingers brushing mine, and though it was the smallest touch, it felt like an entire confession. I don't know how long we stood there, suspended in that quiet, both of us knowing exactly what we were feeling but equally aware of the weight of it. Then my daughter's voice came from upstairs, bright and oblivious, and Emily stepped back, her expression soft but unreadable. Minutes later her ride pulled into the driveway. We carried her bag to the door, my daughter hugging her tightly, promising to text as soon as she got home. When it was my turn, she wrapped her arms around me in a hug that lingered just a little too long, her hand resting lightly at the small of my back, her cheek warm against mine. She whispered a quiet goodbye, so soft I almost wondered if I'd imagined it, and then she was gone, the door closing behind her with a finality that left the house impossibly still. I stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where she'd been, knowing that nothing between us had been spoken out loud, but also knowing with absolute certainty that we'd both felt it, and that I would carry the weight of that weekend with me for a long, long time. If this story touched you, don't forget to like the video and share it with someone who loves deep, emotional storytelling. Subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt LGBTQ+ stories, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a moment. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Leave your thoughts in the comments, I'd love to hear your feelings about this journey.